Ms. Laura for the presentation on the regulations that are coming forth in the United States in the realm of black pepper. Over to you, Laura.
Wonderful. Good evening to all of you, or good morning, depending on where you are. Thank you so much for the opportunity to join you and share some updates about what's happening with the U.S. regulatory environment. For those of you who are familiar with ASTA, the American Spice Trade Association, we represent the importers, growers, processors, and sellers of spices in the United States. And it is core to our mission that we collaborate with our partner organizations such as IPC all around the world. This is absolutely crucial to our success as a global industry. Today, I'm going to give you an update on the regulatory environment in the United States. I'm going to focus on regulations related to pesticides and heavy metals, and I'll also share some general information about import requirements in the United States at the end of my presentation, as well as give you a heads up on some of the emerging regulatory issues that you can expect to see more information about in the coming years. So to start off with, I wanted to provide a little bit of background on the legal framework for regulating pesticides in the United States, since this is rather complicated. There are a few agencies that are involved in the process. The Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, is the agency that establishes tolerances for pesticide residues on food. However, it is the Food and Drug Administration that enforces these tolerances. I'm going to talk a little bit about enforcement by FDA later on and what you can expect of the enforcement environment in the United States. But right now, I'll just say that it is FDA's responsibility, and predominantly where we see this enforcement taking place is at the stage of import. There are several laws and regulations that pertain to the establishment of pesticide residues as they relate to food products. But the big picture is that a food that contains a pesticide residue that either does not have a tolerance, or if that residue is higher than the established tolerance, is considered to be adulterated and illegal in the United States. I want to emphasize that if there is no tolerance established for a specific spice, such as black pepper, then it is our policy in the United States that that tolerance is interpreted as zero, meaning there can be absolutely no residues of that chemical on the spice. We don't officially allow for any de minimis levels, regardless of the level that's observed, even if there's no health or safety concern. As I mentioned a little later on, I'm going to talk about more of the realities of the enforcement risks as they relate to spices, but this is the official letter of the law. Therefore, it is in our best interest as a global spice industry, both to obtain as many tolerances as we can to cover the commodities that we import, and to ensure that there are no residues of chemicals for which there are either no tolerances established, or those chemicals that are occurring on the spice do not exceed the tolerances that are established. Next, I want to move into a discussion about what's going on with chlorpyrifos. You may have already heard something about this, and certainly chlorpyrifos has been getting a lot of attention on the international stage in recent years. The EU recently banned chlorpyrifos a couple of years back, and in the United States, there has been quite a political agenda as it relates to this particular chemical, dating back to the Obama administration, when the US government at that point had taken steps to ban the chemical. After the Trump administration came into office, they halted that ban, and the chemical was continued to be permitted to be used. However, shortly after the Biden administration came into office, they announced that they were revoking all of the US tolerances for chlorpyrifos. And what is particularly concerning and problematic about this initiative is that they established a very, very rapid deadline for the implementation of the ban. And that is actually scheduled to be going into effect within about a week. There were several, currently technically are, for about a week longer, several existing chlorpyrifos tolerances for spices that will be expiring. There are tolerances for chili peppers, peppermint, spearmint, and onion. There has never been, there is not, and there likely never will be a tolerance for chlorpyrifos on black pepper. So under our existing policies in the United States, currently, any detectable level of chlorpyrifos on black pepper would be considered illegal and is not allowed. It's not really impacted by the ban. This was already the situation before the ban went into effect. The ban really only impacts those commodities and chemicals for those commodities for which there already was a chlorpyrifos tolerance, but that is not the case with black pepper. ASTA has been advocating for the FDA to exercise enforcement discretion on the import of spices that contain chlorpyrifos residues. And this has been part of a broader initiative that we've been partnering with the broader food and beverage industry in the United States to make the case that the deadline was too rapid for us, that we need additional time to come into compliance with the new regulations. And in fact, earlier this month, FDA published guidance that heard the industry's concerns and has provided a plan to offer enforcement discretion on the residues of chlorpyrifos of imported commodities and commodities in the United States for a period of about 6 months to 2 years, and then some existing discretion for another couple of years. So, that does offer us some buffer. However, once again, this only really applies to those commodities for which there is an expiring tolerance, as the commodities such as black pepper that never had a tolerance would not officially be subject to this enforcement discretion. In the meantime, we have seen a lawsuit filed by a coalition of farm and agricultural organizations in the United States asking EPA to halt the ban. So there is still some hope amongst the food and ag industry in the United States that this may pause or stop the ban of chlorpyrifos. We still just don't know what's going to happen, but there is some potential that we're going to see the ban reversed or delayed as a result of this lawsuit. So once again, as it relates to black pepper, there has never been a U.S. tolerance for chlorpyrifos on black pepper. So the tolerance is officially 0, and the ban does not change this situation. However, I think there are a number of questions that our industry has as it relates to the actual enforcement environment for chlorpyrifos on imported commodities. Are we expecting that we're going to see more enforcement at the port by FDA of chlorpyrifos? Will FDA start to target commodities that they didn't particularly screen very much before? These are some of the questions that the industry has. And of course, we don't have all the answers at this point in time, but what I can say is that in general, FDA's screening of pesticide residues on spices is relatively infrequent. And I don't foresee that that will change as a result of this new policy. FDA has explicitly told ASTA in conversations that we've had with the head of the Office of Imports that screening for pesticide residues on spices is not a priority. FDA's top priority as it relates to spices is salmonella, and they recognize that the issues of pesticides are not as big of a food safety concern, and therefore they put fewer resources against the enforcement. Additionally, we've seen this FDA guidance published that indicates that the agency is going to offer some additional time for industry to come into compliance. Well, officially, this does not apply to those commodities that did not already have a tolerance for chlorpyrifos. I think that the reality of the situation, how I expect that this will play out practically, is that likely we will not see significant enforcement by FDA of chlorpyrifos at import during this timeline, because I think it's just something that they're signaling to us through the publication of this guidance that they're going to offer some discretion and leeway for a period of time. On my first slide in this section, I explained that we have a zero tolerance for any chemical that there is no established tolerance for. And while that is the official policy, unofficially, the FDA does allow for some discretion as it relates to very, very, very low levels of pesticides that are observed on food. So typically this would be less than 10 parts per billion, upon which we would see that FDA will not take action. So that is something that gives a little bit of leeway. So the bottom line here is that this is certainly something that we need to be aware of as an industry, make strides to reduce the use of chlorpyrifos, remove any commodities that have chlorpyrifos residues on them from export to the US market, but I do not expect to suddenly see a significant change in the enforcement environment as it relates to FDA. What I do expect that you will experience is likely your customers are going to be asking you questions about this. This ban has been very highly publicized, and now the food companies in the United States are suddenly in a situation where they're very aware of chlorpyrifos, and it's very important to them that they start evaluating their supply chains to make sure that they can come into compliance with FDA, to make sure that they don't have a negative news story that comes out about having an illegal chlorpyrifos residue in their supply chain. So what I will expect is that you're going to start getting questions from your customers about the use of chlorpyrifos in your supply chain, that you'll start getting requests for testing of chlorpyrifos on the product. And the reason for this is that the companies in the United States want to make sure that they're legally complying with the law, even if we recognize that there is some discretion that's happening with FDA right now, and they want to avoid any lawsuits or any negative media attention. So that kind of covers off on the issue of chlorpyrifos, but what about other chemical residues? So I have up here on the screen the entire list of all the current US tolerances that are available for black pepper. As you can see, this is not a very long list. There are only a few tolerances that are available for black pepper. Recognizing that this has been a problem for the industry, ASTA has taken an effort to petition the EPA to establish more tolerances for black pepper. And in 2021, we've seen the publication of 2 new tolerances for black pepper. One is for metalaxyl for 0.3 parts per million, and the other is for difenoconazole for 0.1 parts per million. The establishment of a tolerance by EPA requires fairly extensive resources. The agency will require that whoever is petitioning provide a significant amount of data, and there are significant costs associated with the application. There recently was a change in how EPA reviews this data. In the past, EPA would require that there be field trials that would be submitted to support the application of a pesticide tolerance for an imported commodity. However, ASTA was able to make the case to EPA that this is not a practical arrangement for spices, given the nature of how our commodities are traded and commingled. And based on our advocacy, EPA has agreed that ASTA may use monitoring data in place of the field trial data. And this reduces the resources required to submit a petition to the EPA significantly, which is why we have started the process now of starting to petition EPA for more tolerances, because the barrier to submitting the petitions has now become lower. And those two new tolerances for metalaxyl and difenoconazole that ASTA petitioned were based on this new policy of being able to provide the monitoring data. So what this means is that we know that we can be effective at establishing new tolerances. However, we do still need to have that data. And we do have a couple of new petitions in the pipeline that we are working on. One is to extend the tolerance that's available for azoxystrobin on other spices of 38 parts per million to also apply to black pepper. We are planning to submit a petition together with some other commodity groups in March to ask for this to happen. I should also mention that it is not a very fast process. Once you submit the petition with all of the data, which of course takes a significant time to be able to consolidate, the agency can take between 18 months and 2 years in order to grant the petition. And we've actually seen that they have been significantly delayed recently due to understaffing and challenges related to the pandemic. We're also planning to submit a petition for cypermethrin, and this is based on the Codex tolerance. So the idea is that it would cover fruit and berry spices and root and rhizome spices. So this is a little bit of a different process than the petitions that we submitted previously, which were based on monitoring data. So we're still working with EPA exactly on the details of how this process will work for us, but we're hoping that we'll work that out with them within the next month or two to be able to submit the petition for cypermethrin as well. It is possible for us to pursue other chemicals, and this is a real opportunity for us to collaborate as a global industry, since your industry knows which chemicals are being used by farmers, to what extent, and what the residues are of those chemicals on black pepper. Since we need to be able to submit that data, we need at least 70 data points for each pesticide. And those need to be detectable levels. It cannot be below the level of detection. So 70 detected data points to be able to support the petition. So there is an opportunity for us to collaborate on pursuing future chemicals, future pesticide tolerance petitions. But I will note that some chemicals are just not going to be possible due to the political environment. Obviously, chlorpyrifos is very challenging right now, given the situation of the ban and how much attention and political challenge there is with that chemical. Same thing with the chemical carbendazim. There's just never going to be a possibility to pursue that chemical. And there are a number of others for which we just will not really have the opportunity, given the safety of the chemical or the political nature around it, to pursue new tolerances for. But there are others for which it may be possible. So this is certainly an opportunity for us to work together as an industry to reduce all of our risk. Beyond establishing new tolerances, since certainly there are these chemicals for which we're just never going to be able to get tolerances in the United States, given the political situation, it is also really important that in order to reduce our risk, that we continue to work at origin in order to provide farmer training on the proper use of agricultural chemicals. ASTA has been partnering with a coalition with the Sustainable Spice Initiative, IDH, the European Spice Initiative, the European Spice Association, and the Vietnamese Pepper Association over the last 5 years on a project to promote sustainable farming practices, which is predominantly centered around providing information and training on responsible agrochemical use and residue policies. So far, this project in Vietnam has been successful at developing a more compliant black pepper supply, and we're excited to continue this partnership to further work towards having a more compliant supply. So now I'm going to switch gears and talk about the issue of heavy metals. back in November, there was a publication in the journal Consumer Reports, which is a very, very well-known investigative journal that highlighted the potential for spices to be contaminated with heavy metals. According to the report, about 1/3 of the spices that they tested about 140 samples of spices that they found had levels of heavy metals that they found to be of concern. ASTA takes some issue with the methodology that was used by this publication, but it has received some significant attention by the public and other media outlets. Additionally, we're seeing governmental attention to the issue of heavy metals in spices on the international level, on the federal level within the United States, and with specific states in the United States, such as California and New York. For those of you who may be following the Codex Alimentarius process, this group establishes global limits for a variety of contaminants in commodities. This group is working on the process of establishing proposed maximum levels for lead in spices. And the latest round of the proposals I have up on the screen here. Codex tends to take a long time, so I would not, and go through many, many different iterations and revisions. So I would not necessarily see these levels as being final at this point in time, but what is interesting about this process is that the Codex levels are differing based on the type of spice or herb. And this is a similar approach to what we've seen the EU adopt. The EU back in 2021 recently adopted proposed limits for heavy metals in spices as well. And there were different levels that were established for different types of spices. This seems to be like a good process for the industry because based on the kind of spice, you can see differences in the heavy metals naturally occurring. So this seems to be working well on the international level. Federally in the United States right now, the majority of the attention as it relates to heavy metals is on heavy metals in foods that are consumed by babies and toddlers. There was a congressional report early in 2021 that highlighted concerning levels of heavy metals in baby food. And in response to this congressional report, FDA has launched what they refer to as their Closer to Zero initiative, which is a process that they are working to establish limits for heavy metals in baby foods. We have been in close communication with the FDA about this process, and they have specifically told us that they're not concerned about spices, and they're not at this time planning on establishing federal limits for heavy metals in spices. We have worked with FDA on the issue of heavy metals and spices for many years, and while there is no official guidance level in the United States for heavy metals, the US FDA has informed ASTA that they use 1 part per million as an unofficial limit for heavy metals in spices. So we will continue to monitor this and to work with FDA, and potentially it could be within our interest to actually see an official limit or official limits established by FDA for spices, because we are seeing some activity on the state level that makes it very challenging for us to comply. So what we saw is that in May of 2021, New York State announced new action levels for heavy metals in spices. And these action levels are very low and very challenging for the industry to comply with. They announced a new level of 0.21 parts per million for lead and inorganic arsenic, and 0.26 parts per million for cadmium. Immediately, ASTA responded to New York and indicated that these levels were not achievable for the industry and that we would have problems with the implementation of these levels. Based on our advocacy efforts, the state has now put these levels on hold while they do further research into the issue, and we are continuing to advocate for the state to use a different approach to establish different levels. So at this point, we at least have some time before these start to go into effect, because we've been able to successfully tell the state that the industry will not be able to comply with these levels. At the same time, we also have issues in the state of California as it relates to Proposition 65, which tends to result in a fair bit of litigation related to the heavy metal content in spices. And we have now also seen some class action litigation in response to the publication of the Consumer Reports article. I want to touch on the issue of salmonella, since this continues to be the top food safety priority for the spice industry, and it is FDA's priority as it relates to the screening of imported spices. FDA, under the Food Safety Modernization Act, requires that all companies have a validated kill step for salmonella to be applied to spices before those spices are consumed by the final end consumer. That kill step can be applied either at origin or it can be applied within the United States, but it needs to be applied at some point in time prior to the food being given to the consumer. The validation studies that FDA is requiring are quite extensive, and this has been a challenge for our industry. What we're starting to see is that FDA is fairly heavily screening spices at import for the presence of salmonella. And if the spices are found to be positive for salmonella, FDA is saying, well, I want to see your validation study. If that product will be treated in the United States, I want to see your validation study before we're going to release the salmonella from our import alert and hold. And as FDA is looking through the validation studies, they're holding the industry to a very, very high standard for what those studies must entail. And one of the biggest challenges that we have is that there are so many different spices that sometimes companies, would like to do a validation study on one spice and have that be applicable to a group of spices. And that is permitted, but there needs to be a certain amount of evidence that can be provided in the study that shows that that is scientifically valid. So ASTA is working on publishing resources for the industry. We have a paper on salmonella detection methods. We've provided a literature review on irradiation that demonstrates that a 5 kilogram dose of irradiation is sufficient to achieve a 5-log reduction of salmonella in spices. And we're working on providing updated guidance on how to provide validation studies for groups of spices in a way that FDA will find acceptable, and that is coming soon. So I was asked to provide just a little bit of information on the general import requirements for spices into the United States. And so I have a little bit of information on the screen on the key requirements for importing spices into the United States. I also have an email address for Customs and Border Protection import specialists who can provide more information about the documentation requirements. And I would advise that any companies who are looking to get involved in importing food to the United States who have not in the past, consider working with a licensed customs broker to assist with the import requirements, as that may be a practical way to help come into compliance. And there are lists of those licensed customs brokers on the Customs and Border Protection website. The FDA also provides a list of what the requirements are for imported food products, so it's important to be aware of the prior notice of imported foods requirement, as well as compliance with the Foreign Supplier Verification Program. And you can see more about these requirements at the link on the screen. Finally, I just wanted to touch on a few emerging regulatory issues that we can expect to see more of in the coming years. The FDA has launched an initiative called the New Era of Food Safety, and this is very focused on tech-enabled traceability. So while technically we don't have these traceability requirements in effect now, we clearly see that this is something that FDA is very interested in and wants to see the industry starting to embrace more of. I also want to note that last year we saw the passage of the FASTER Act, which adds sesame as a major allergen in the United States, which means that any product containing sesame must be labeled with an allergen label to inform the consumer that the product may contain sesame, and if products are processed together with sesame, there needs to be good manufacturing practices in place to ensure that the cross-contact is managed. Finally, I want to note that we're seeing more attention at Customs and Border Protection on the potential of goods to be produced with forced labor. While at the moment this is really focused on China, we expect to see much more broad concerns from Customs and Border Protection about the issue of forced labor. And the challenge here is that there are fairly significant documentation requirements that are also somewhat unclear to the industry what exactly will be able to be offered for compliance purposes. So that's something that we expect to see more of and be working on as an industry in the future. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. I finally just want to note that we are having our first in-person annual meeting since the start of the pandemic in Miami, April 10th to 12th. I hope you guys will all join us. Registration is open, so if you have an interest in traveling to the meeting, please feel free to join us. And that brings me to the end of my presentation.
Well, thank you, Laura. That was a very nice presentation, and indeed you gave us good insights on what is going to happen with chlorpyrifos, which most of the industry participants have been asking for past 6 months. And in addition to that, heavy metals or other parameters such as salmonella, this would be actually very helpful for everybody, right, from the growers to processors to traders, etc., who would be shipping their products to the US market or want to ship the products to the US market. Thank you indeed.